Welcome back, Gerard van Bohemen from Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and this time we're talking about mining in Antarctica. So people are saying that Antarctica is going to be the new El Dorado, so is there gold in them there hills?
Well, I'm not a geologist, so I'm not able to give you the definitive answer on that, but if you take the hypothesis that Antarctica and Australia and New Zealand are all part of Gondwana land, and we know that at least in Australia there are significant mineral resources, one would assume that there's a significant mineral resource in the Antarctic, yes.
So at the moment we're seeing the race for hydrocarbons at the North Pole, oil, with Russia, the United States, Canada all vying for the resources that are beneath the seabed up there. How likely are we to see that at the South Pole?
Not very likely. I mean, I'd say that what's happening in the Arctic is that each of those countries with an Arctic-facing border is looking to protect its rights on the continental shelf that underlies the Arctic ice cap. So in the Arctic, you have no disagreement about who owns the resources. You might have disagreement about where the lines are drawn between countries' boundaries, but the legal regime that applies there is very clear. It's the law of the Sea Convention and its rules on continental shelves which will determine the resource, who owns the resources and the right to exploit them. So the rush that was happening a few years ago in the Arctic was each country wanted to make sure that they had maximised their rights or their arguments to say where the shelves went. And I think you saw that case with the Russian submarine dropping a flag, which had zero legal effect, but it was a publicity stunt. But the question there was ownership of the Lomonosov Ridge, which a number of different countries assert rights to. Now, in the Antarctic, of course, you have land, and although there are also issues around the continental shelf beyond the coastline, the significant issue is that there is no agreed international regime over ownership of Antarctica. There are 7 countries that assert sovereignty over parts of Antarctica, including New Zealand, but there are also a significant number of countries that refuse to respect those claims. And the Antarctic Treaty was the system that was put in place to deal with how do you manage human activity where you have no agreement on the underlying sovereignty. And the issue of minerals was recognised very early in the piece as being one of the most difficult ones to address in that context, because obviously ownership rights come to the fore the moment you want to dig something up and exploit it. And for a long time it was put on the sort of back burner with the Antarctic Treaty as a problem that was almost too hard to solve. But in the 1970s, New Zealand took the lead in arguing we couldn't afford to just push this issue to one side, because there was a concern that a scramble for resources could happen. And the concern that we had was that if that were to happen, you could see that this regime of cooperation that had been very successful in Antarctica, and which protects our southern boundaries, if you think of it that way in a security sense, could unravel if people started to elbow their way in there. So we were one of the countries leading the call for the negotiation of a regime to address the issue of Antarctic minerals exploitation. And that negotiation finally kicked off in 1982 here in Wellington and went for 6 years. And it produced a convention which was something of a masterpiece of diplomacy and international lawmaking, in the sense that it did address the issue of how do you manage the resource in this contested sovereignty space. But it also was negotiated at a time of increasing environmental awareness, and although there are strong environmental rules built into that convention, the whole notion that we should be, in a sense, allowing mining to take place became highly contentious. And so by the time the negotiation concluded, 2 of the key parties involved, France and Australia, took the position that, well, they're not going to go into this convention at all because they don't want to be associated with any mining. And there was a strong argument in New Zealand that we should also take that position, which was a challenge for the government of the day because we'd put so much effort into negotiating this thing in the first place. But within quite a short space of time, it was recognised that if you've got some key players, and you need France and you need Australia and you need New Zealand for this regime to work, If they were not going to make this regime work, then we had to find some other way of dealing with it.
So is that how we got to the current position of protection with the Madrid Protocol?
Well, currently we have now, so the Convention for the Regulation of Antarctic Mineral Resource Activities was essentially put on the shelf. It still sits there. It's been signed by a great number of countries, but none of them have taken the next step of ratification, and it just sits there. But shortly afterwards there was a big push to put in place an alternative regime based on environmental protection, and that was how we got to the Protocol on the Protection of the Antarctic Environment. And key to that protocol is the prohibition on mining, and it puts in place a 50-year moratorium or prohibition on any mineral resource activities in Antarctica. So that's the regime that applies now. It's an agreed commitment by all of the Antarctic Treaty parties that there will be no mineral resource activities, at least for the next 25 years.
How likely is this protection to last until 2048 and afterwards?
Well, this is one of those judgments of political prognostication you have to make. First off, I'll go back and say that the Antarctic Treaty itself had a 30-year time frame, and people thought, well, when the 30 years happen, it will fall over, and it hasn't. It continues. Because it was in the interest of all of the participants to keep it going. So in the case of the mining ban, you have a number of protections, both procedural and political. The first is that you can't ask for a review of it for 50 years, so that sits there. Then if you do ask for a review, there are various numerical majorities you have to achieve to have the review in the first place, and in the second place to adopt an alternative regime. And that second decision has to have the agreement of all of the consultative parties, which includes New Zealand. So we've got a veto over that. And the third protection is that you can only lift the prohibition if you have in place a regime that can properly assess and monitor and control the effects of mineral activities. In other words, a proper environmentally based regime. So it's not just a question of lifting the prohibition and off you go. You actually have to negotiate an alternative regime. So Cranborough sits there. You might look to that for some sort of model, but you wouldn't expect that a negotiation 50 years on would necessarily adopt the same rules. There'll be some different perspectives. There is the one sort of caveat to all of that. There's another provision in the protocol that says if you've tried to get all of those things in place but you can't actually agree on a new regime, then a country can give notice and withdraw from the protocol. And at that point, it's no longer bound by the prohibition. So the risk then is you could see then unilateral action, people starting to go and charging into the Antarctic and say, well, we've had enough of that regime, it doesn't work for us. Now, I don't think it's likely that anyone will do that, because it's not just about minerals resource activities. Antarctica is a place that is important for a whole bunch of reasons, climate related, science related, and political and security related too. And so keeping the southern continent free of discord and confrontation is terribly important to all of the players down there, including us. If you were to take that unilateral action, you'd put all of that at risk, not just the mining plan, but also the Antarctic Treaty System. So I don't think it's very likely that we'd see that sort of an outcome.